Let's revisit the lesson question. How does subjective language help a speaker mark a historic moment? Now, historic moments can come in many forms. Take a look at the picture on your screen. Here we have a bridge being constructed. Now, at the completion of this bridge, an important person might stand up and give a speech to people who live in the community to commemorate or to celebrate the completion of that bridge. Now, if that's the case, that would be considered a formal speech, right? Now, in this lesson, you're going to be learning a few things, different types of speeches, the language used in speeches, and how to objectively summarize a speech or other type of writing. Now, it's important that we begin by looking at the historic moment that has to do with the speech that you're going to be reading, the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. Now we're ready to speak in more detail about speeches. Now, a speech is one way to communicate to a group of people about a particular subject. Now, when giving a speech, you can generally expect your speaker to present ideas logically in an organized manner. So that means it will have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is so important if you're giving a speech to a live audience because they can't hit rewind if they miss something. So it's very important that you organize your speech so that they get everything you're saying. A speaker will want to connect with the audience, and they can do this through their word choice and through their body language and facial expression. The speaker will choose words depending on the purpose and the topic of the speech, and the speaker will generally aim to have listeners feel, think, or act in a specific way. Now, we're going to talk in more detail about different reasons why people give speeches. So let's look at the purposes of some speeches. You might have a speech that is simply to inform, present information to the audience. Maybe you're giving a speech simply to entertain your audience or to demonstrate how to do something. And then, of course, there is the speech that is meant to persuade, that is meant to change somebody's opinion about a subject or topic or get them to act in a certain way. Now it's your turn to practice matching a topic or subject to the purpose behind the speech. The building of the Brooklyn Bridge was a historical moment worth talking about, and yes, even writing a speech about. So let's look at what made this Brooklyn Bridge so important and worth talking about. Now, the Brooklyn Bridge was the longest bridge built at its time in the Western Hemisphere. Now, it was built in 1883. And as you're going to find out, this bridge was pretty impressive at the time it was built. Now, it needed to be tall enough for ships to pass underneath. Now, as you can see on your screen here, this is a picture of it. The waterway in which that the bridge crossed was very busy, full of cargo boats coming in and out of the area. So the bridge had to be quite tall. Now, because it had to be quite tall, it had to be very strong. So the bridge was made out of steel. And during the 1800s, bridges were made out of iron. So the steel is obviously stronger than iron, and it was quite advanced for the time period. Now, its construction made it easier for people to travel from Manhattan to Brooklyn and back. So prior to the bridge, the only way across from Brooklyn to Manhattan was by ferry boat. So by creating this bridge, it allowed people to access these two parts of New York City much easier. Now it's your turn to recall some of these facts. The Brooklyn Bridge didn't just pop up overnight. It took many years of planning and then building. Now, the first phase of the project took a total of 4 years. And it began in 1866 when legislation is passed to build the bridge. So a law had to be passed saying, yes, you can build this bridge in this location. Right after that, in 1867, a man by the name of John Roebling started developing plans for the bridge, and he also formed the company that would later build the bridge. Sadly, in 1869, he passed away. However, his son, Washington Roebling, stepped in and took over the process of building the bridge. So the bridge building actually began right here in 1870. Now, 2 years after that, Washington Roebling is seriously injured while working on the bridge to the point that he can no longer build the bridge. So with the assistance of his wife, he continued to oversee the project. Now, the bridge was finally completed in 1883. Now, it's important to keep the steps in mind that you see on this timeline so that you understand everything that went into building the Brooklyn Bridge. Let me introduce you to the designer of the Brooklyn Bridge, John Roebling. He was born in Prussia in 1806, which is part of modern-day Germany, and he later died in 1869. Now, while living in Prussia, he worked and studied as an engineer and an architect, but he emigrated or left Prussia for the United States in 1831. Now, in the United States, while he was working as a civil engineer, he invented the twisted wire rope cable. Now, this cable was very significant. It made it possible to build even longer suspension bridges. Now, as you know, he designed the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was the longest suspension bridge of its time. Now, sadly, he died before the bridge was finished. A boat fell and crushed both of his feet, and he died from tetanus. Now, his son Washington took over the project, but like his father, he was injured on the job. He became permanently paralyzed as a result of bends, which is an illness that occurs when you're working deep underwater. Now, it's important to recognize all of the contributions that John Roebling made to the building of suspension bridges. Let's take a moment to revisit our lesson question. How does subjective language help a speaker mark a historic moment? Now, we've spent a lot of time speaking about how the building of the Brooklyn Bridge was a historic moment worth talking about in a speech. We've also talked about things you can expect when you're listening to a speech, as well as different purposes for speeches. So now we're going to be looking more specifically at the language that people will use when giving a speech. One of your lesson goals has to do with understanding the difference between objective and subjective language. Now, objective language expresses facts. It can be supported by a person's senses. Now, facts is the key distinguisher between objective and subjective language. Now, facts can be proven, verified. They are true for everyone. Now, on the flip side of that, you have subjective language, which expresses an opinion about how someone thinks or feels. You see the difference? Now we're talking about opinions, and opinions are not true for everyone. They vary depending on our feelings, our beliefs, and the way we think. So I want you to connect objective language with facts and subjective language with opinion. So let's look at examples of objective language. 200 people attended the play. Can you prove that? You could prove that. There's probably a list. Somebody's collecting tickets, right? So that is considered a fact. The play is 2 hours long. You can also prove that. You can verify it. So it's a fact. Tickets for the play can be purchased online. Now that's another fact. So all of these are facts, which in turn are referred to as objective language. Language that expresses facts. Now, let's go over here and look at subjective language. Now, remember, subjective language expresses opinions. So all of these are going to be opinion statements. I really like the play. Well, you've got some clues here. I and really liked. Sounds very personal, right? Not everybody might have really liked the play. So that's an opinion. It's subjective language. Let's look at the next one. Everyone should see the play. Everyone should. Not everybody would agree. If somebody didn't like the play, they might think that everybody should stay home instead. Again, an opinion. Finally, I thought the play was funny. Well, there's your big indicator. I thought. Not everybody might have thought the play was funny. So here we're dealing with opinions that are being expressed, and we call that subjective language. Now, I want you to keep this information in mind as you try to sort objective and subjective language. Now we're going to talk about the connection between language and purpose in speech. We're going to look specifically at the difference between persuasive and informative speeches. So let's begin with speeches that are meant to persuade. Now, persuasive speeches influence a reader. Now, the speaker might want the reader to change their opinion, to buy a product, or even to take action in one form or another. Now, in order to influence the reader, the speaker is going to appeal to their emotions. So they're going to be using lots of words and phrases that really get at the heart of the matter, of somebody's feelings, as it's associated with the subject or the topic. Now, persuasive speeches are going to rely heavily on subjective language. And remember, that is the type of language that we use to express opinions. Now, if the speaker is doing a good job, they are going to back up their opinion by presenting evidence in the form of facts. Now, let's go and look at how informative speeches are put together. Now, informative speeches avoid the opinion and go straight to the evidence, facts, and data. Now, these types of speeches will appeal to logic instead of emotion. So it'll appeal to the way we think logically. We see something, we're going to read the facts and the data, we're going to process it in our mind and keep our feelings out of it. Therefore, informative speeches use objective language. Remember, objective language, unlike subjective language, expresses facts. Now, you're going to sort phrases based on whether or not they are persuasive or informative. So keep this information in mind. It's time for you to meet Seth Low. Now, Seth Low wrote and delivered the speech that you're going to be reading next. Now, he wrote this speech as part of the dedication when the Brooklyn Bridge was opened to citizens in New York. Now, at the time the bridge was opened, he was mayor of Brooklyn, so it was fitting that he was there to give the speech. He also sat on the board of the company that built the Brooklyn Bridge, so he was very involved in the process. Now, later on, he became mayor of New York City and remained mayor from 1901 to 1903. It's also important to know that he was president of Columbia College. Now, I want you to keep in mind everything we've been talking about in regards to speeches, because next you're going to read the speech that Seth Low gave at the dedication of the Brooklyn Bridge.